We're up to chapter 6, right? So let's look at our homework schedule and see what's coming up. Oh, this is the exam schedule, okay. Exam 3, November 16th, right? So today is what, the 5th? So 11 days from today. And homework. The chapter 5 homework, which we did last week, right? That is due tomorrow. And the chapter 6 homework due next Friday. Okay. Now, if I remember right, we got through all of chapter 5. There was nothing left over, right? And something very important that we learned in chapter 5 that will carry over to chapter 6 is this concept of contribution margin. So remember what contribution margin was. It was sales revenue minus variable cost. And we saw that there were maybe 3 different ways we could express that. One way was just based on gross numbers. What is total revenue minus total variable cost is contribution margin. That was one way we saw it. Another way we saw it, and go back to that Starbucks example in the chapter. Another way we could express it was on a per unit basis. You know, a cup of coffee. If I remember the numbers right, it was they sell a cup of coffee for $2.50. That's the revenue per unit minus the variable costs. I forget. I think it was $1. So that the contribution margin was $1.50. And then we could also express it as what they called contribution margin ratio, where we take the contribution margin, whatever that number is, it could be per unit or total, the contribution margin divided by the sales revenue, and you get a percentage for that. So those are the 3 ways that we saw contribution margin. And that's important because when we get to chapter 6 now, we're going to see we need to use contribution margin in a different way. We're going to calculate things like break-even point. What do we need to break even? How many units of a product do we need to set to break even? Good thing to know if you had a business, right? How many of these things that I have, how many of them do I need to sell to break even? We can see it expressed that way on a per unit basis. How many units does it take to break even? We could also see dollars. How many dollars of sales do we need to break even? So let's take a look. There's 2 videos. They're short. One is a lecture and one is homework. Hello again. Chapter 6. Hold on a second. I want to stop the recording while I'm playing the video, okay? Start the recording again. All right, let's see if we can do one together.
We do have a homework due tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay. When's our next quiz or test?
Okay, well, you can always go on Blackboard to find out, but I think it was the 16th.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I wanted to do one of these with you together, right? So you could get a little more practice. And exercise 10 looks like a pretty good one. All right, let's take a look at exercise 10. Last month, Laredo Company sold 450 units for $25 each. During the month, fixed costs were 2,520 and variable costs were $9 per unit. So here's what they want us to do. Determine unit contribution margin, 25 minus 9, and contribution margin ratio. Now, 25 minus 9 is 16, so contribution margin ratio would be 16 over 25, right? Calculate the break-even point in units and sales dollars, right? So how do you calculate break-even point in units? Fixed cost divided by unit contribution margin, right? Which is 25 minus 9 is 16. And sales dollars, fixed cost divided by contribution margin ratio, right? The number that we calculated here. And then compute the margin of safety in units and as a percentage of sales. Right? Remember what the margin of safety is. The margin of safety is the actual sales minus the break-even sales, right? So why don't you try to do that? Take out a piece of paper and try to work on that. All right, let's take about maybe 10 minutes to work on that. All right, let's see. How can I do this?
There should be a whiteboard function if you.
Yeah, I don't like that. I've tried that before. I'll just use Excel. Okay. So this is exercise 6-10, right? And in the book, this is on page 289. Okay. And part 1 wants us to determine unit CM, right? Unit contribution margin and CM ratio. Okay, so what do they tell us in the problem? They tell us that the selling price was $25 a unit and the variable costs were $9 a unit. So selling price or sales price, 25. variable cost. 9. What's 25 minus 9? 16. Real hard, right, class? Real tough stuff. Right, so that's the unit CM. Okay, now, contribution margin ratio. A little bit harder. You know, some people are freaked out by percentages and things like that. But let me say this is per unit. Right, and this is CM ratio. Let me get this out of here. Okay, so how would we figure out this contribution margin ratio? We take the contribution margin, which is 16, and put it over the selling price, which is 25. 16 over 25 is 0.64, or 64%. Right? I mean, that's all there is to that. Now, if you want to show the whole thing, what you could do is you could say here, now they're only asking for this, right? But if you want to get a complete understanding of this, what does this all mean? That the contribution margin is 64% of the selling price. That's really what it means. The selling price is 100% of the selling price, right? 25 over 25. Which means the variable costs are what? What's $1 minus 64 cents? It's 36 cents. Now, again, they didn't ask you for all of this. If you wanted to do this in terms of percentages, you could say that's 100%, that's 36%, that's 64%, right? I prefer decimals to percents, but you know, it all depends on how they want you to answer the question. So that takes care of the first part of the question. And if we want to calculate break-even point in units, we use the $16. If we want to calculate the break-even point in sales dollars, we use the 64%. And that's the reason why they gave you this problem like this, because that's what they wanted to see if you could do. Right, so part 2 of the problem is asking you calculate break-even point in units and dollars. In units, break-even point in units is equal to what? Fixed cost divided by contribution margin per unit, right? So in our particular case in this problem, the fixed costs were 2,520. The contribution margin was $16 a unit. That comes out to it comes out to 157.5. But how can you sell half a unit, right? You have to round it up to 158 units, right? 158 units. So 158 units to break even. Okay, in dollars, break-even point in dollars is equal to fixed cost divided by contribution margin ratio. The fixed costs are 25.20. The contribution margin ratio was 64% or 0.64. right? And that comes out to 3937.5, right? But they usually want you to round. So I'm going to say 3938 dollars. All right, so that's break-even point in units and dollars. Fixed cost divided by contribution margin per unit for the number of units. And break-even point in dollars, fixed cost divided by that contribution margin ratio, which if you like percents, you can use the percent sign. I don't like percents because I don't like percents in a calculator. You know, maybe it's because I'm so old that when I went to school, we didn't have calculators. I hate to tell you that, right? I didn't have a calculator, so I learned how to do math the hard way, I guess. So a 0.64 to me is easier to work with than 64%. I know calculators have percent keys, and I just never got comfortable working with the percent key. Okay, let's take a look at the next thing they want. Part 3. All right, part 3, compute margin of safety, MOS, right? Margin of safety in units and as a percent of sales. Okay. Okay. So what was margin of safety, first of all? It was actual sales minus break even sales, right? That was margin of safety. So in this problem, how did we get actual sales? They told you, right, actual sales, 450 units were sold at $25 a piece, right? 450 units were sold at $25 a piece, right? That's actual sales. Well, 450 times 25, 11,250. So actual sales were 250. Break even sales, whoops. Break even sales, right? Well, we calculated those earlier, and the break even sales, go back up here, came out to 39.38 minus 39.38. Right, that'll give you the margin of safety, 11,250 minus 39.38 comes out to 7,312. So that's the margin of safety, right? But that's not what they're asking. They're asking, what is the margin of safety on a per unit basis and as a percentage of sales? So MOS per unit would be what? It would be taking that 7,312 and dividing it by the number of units that were sold. How many units were sold? 450, right? So that, to me, looks like it comes out to $16.25 per unit. $16.25 per unit. Margin of safety as a percent of sales. Well, let's see. let's take the margin of safety, which is 7312, and divide it by sales. What was sales? 11,250, right? And if I do that, 7312 over 11,250 comes out to 65%, right? 0.649999, I think it actually came out to, right? Which rounded, that'll come out to 65%, right? So I don't think we talked about that in the chapter when we talked about margin of safety. Yes, we talked about computing margin of safety, but we didn't talk about it on a per unit basis or as a percentage of sales. But you can see it's just a simple calculation. Per unit, divide by the number of units. As a percentage of sales, take the margin of safety over the sales, right? And that'll give you that, that number. Okay. Let's look at exercise 15. We got two companies. You see them? Remo and Angelo. Two companies. I'll bet you these are the names of two students, right, that he used in when he wrote the book. So Remo and Angelo are separate companies that operate in the same industry. Following are variable costing income statements for the two companies showing their different cost structures. So imagine you're a big investor, right? You're a Warren Buffett type person, and you've got these two companies that are in the same industry. They're very similar. They do similar things, and their structure, their financial structure is very similar, right? Which company would you invest in? Which one do you think is better than the other? Now, again, a lot of this stuff like variable cost, this is not information that's released to the public. So you would have to do some analysis based on, how you calculate those numbers, right? And again, there's a lot of smart people out there that are very good working with numbers, that they can estimate these things pretty well. So let's say you're one of those people that's able to do that, and you could take the financial statements of these two companies and you could turn them into this variable costing income statement. Now, if you look at the companies, look, top line, the same. 275, exactly the same. Bottom line, 40,000, exactly the same. So which company would you pick? Which company is better? Which company is able to withstand downturns in the economy or take advantage of other opportunities that come up? What would you say? I mean, how would you come to that determination, right? So briefly describe the similarities and differences of the two companies and calculate the break-even sales revenue for each company. All right, why don't we take another couple of minutes to work on that, right? And then after this, we'll be finished for today. Take another 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. How you would go about answering a question like this, right? So again, remember, when it comes time to invest your own money, your hard-earned money, how do you decide where to put it? And most of us would look at income statements and balance sheets and do financial ratios like we see in the book. I think there's a chapter in the book 1213 where you go over those financial ratios, and you do things like that because it's hard to compare one company to another sometimes, because sometimes you might have a company that's huge, and how do you compare that to a small company that does the same thing? The small company might be the better place to invest your money, right? So bigger is not always better, as they say. So anyhow, so let's look at these two companies now. How are these companies similar? Well, they have the same top line and the same bottom line. But how are they different? Everything in between is different. So even though they do the same things, one company's variable costs are more than the other. One company's fixed costs are more than the other, right? And what do you know about fixed cost? Fixed cost is something you have to pay no matter what. So if, I don't know, if the economy goes bad, if we go into recession or something happens, maybe this particular industry, the government enacts a law that affects this industry in a negative way, and that's happened before. This company still has to pay all these fixed costs. These fixed costs are 3 times what this company pays. So how are the companies similar? Same top line, same bottom line, but the cost structures are very different, and this fixed cost would frighten me, right? Okay. So let's calculate the break-even sales for each company. Now, how do you calculate break-even sales? You have to first calculate that contribution margin percentage. So how do we calculate that percentage? We take the contribution margin over sales. 75,000 over 275. 150 over 275, right? So let's get our Excel out again. All right, so this is exercise 6-15. And this was on page 290, right? So I'm not even going to bother writing this down about the about how are the companies similar and how are they different, right? I think you could just look at that and draw your own conclusion about that, right? But how do we calculate break-even sales revenue? Break-even sales revenue. Based on the information they gave us. So break-even sales revenue, you would do what? You would take fixed cost divided by that contribution margin ratio. Okay, so we got the two companies, right? We got Remo and Angelo. Fixed cost divided by contribution margin ratio. Okay, now first we have to calculate the contribution margin ratio for each company. Right? So it would be what? Contribution margin ratio would be contribution margin over sales. Let's put that in here again. Equals CM divided by sales, right? So for Remo, contribution margin is 75,000 divided by sales, which are 275, which is equal to 27%, right? 27%. And for Angelo, contribution margin is 150 divided by sales at 275. Contribution margin ratio is 55%. So then if we come back here and we substitute numbers into the formula, fixed cost divided by contribution margin ratio, fixed cost for Remo is 35,000 divided by 0.27 or 27%, right? That is equal to $129,630. This company needs to have $129,630 of sales to break even. And if you look at their sales are 275, right? So what's the difference between 275 and 129, right? That's like about $145,000. That's their margin of safety. It didn't ask you for the margin of safety, right? But you see, the more you work on these things, the concepts become alive to you. So the bigger the margin of safety, the better you feel about doing business with that particular company. What about for Angelo? Well, Angelo's fixed costs are $110,000, right? And their contribution margin ratio is 55%. 110 divided by 0.55 is $200,000. $200,000. Angelo has to do $200,000 in sales to break even. What's Angelo's margin of safety? 275 minus 200 is only $75,000. Remo's margin of safety is double that, right? So if I was given a choice, all things being equal, and I had to do either lend money or invest money in these two companies, you know, I say Remo has it hands down, right? Now, they didn't ask you that, but that's kind of the reason why you would do something like that, to decide whether or not you should invest or lend money to a particular company, right? So when you first look at it, they look the same top line, same bottom line. You say, oh, what the heck's the difference? I'll invest in the company where I like the guy better, right? Or the one that has the nicer package on their product, or the one that has the funny commercial on TV, or things like that, you know. But when you really get down to it and you crunch the numbers, you see that Remo represents, at least based on what we see here, they represent a much better value than Angelo does. All right, so we come to the end of another class. Chapter 6 is in the book. Remember, Chapter 5 homework is due tomorrow. Chapter 6 homework is due by next Friday. You know, but as I always say, don't let it go to the end. And then we have Chapter 7, right? And then comes the exam. So if there's no questions, I will say goodbye. And I will see you next Thursday.
Have a good one, Professor.
Okay.
You, Professor.
Have a good weekend, Professor.
You too. Be well.
Have a good weekend.